Welcome to this SPHN training, which will tackle the topic of the SPHN Dataset Template in its version of 2024.2. You will learn how to build a project-specific RDF schema from this template. My name is Vasundra Touré, and I'm a scientific coordinator at the Personalized Health Informatics Group from the SIB, Swiss Institute of Bioinformatics. A project in SPHN has the possibility to extend the semantics defined in the SPHN dataset to fit their needs. There are two options that are available. The project can either take the SPHN Dataset Template to build manually their project dataset and then give it as an input to the SPHN Schema Forge web service to generate, among other things, the project RDF schema. The second option is that the project can take the SPHN RDF schema directly and use any editor of their choice to add their own RDF content in a project RDF schema. In this presentation, we focus on option 1. The SPHN Dataset Template is an Excel-based file that contains all the content from the SPHN dataset. It is intended to be used by members of a project for extending the SPHN dataset with project-specific concepts. The project is allowed to do two things. They can add new project-specific concepts with either project-specific composed ofs or reuse existing SPHN composed ofs that are defined in the SPHN dataset. Or the project can also extend the existing SPHN concepts but with only project-specific composed ofs. Currently, for an existing SPHN concept, a project cannot add existing SPHN composed ofs. Please be aware that any content already written in the SPHN dataset must not be deleted or changed in any way. So first, you need to go to the metadata sheet and add the metadata information of your project, which will be written in the RDF schema. You can observe that the metadata of SPHN is already added to this sheet. The line below is meant to be used by the project to add their project metadata. Let's take the example of a project named example. The following is how the metadata sheet must be filled. First, give it a prefix, a title, and a description. You then need to provide a version information. In here, you can see that the first version of the project RDF schema in 2024 is being defined. In the case the project had created another version of an RDF schema previously, you can refer to it as a prior version. Here the project did not have any, so it remained empty. A copyright and license information must be provided. And finally, a canonical and versioned IRI must be given following the biomedid.ch IRI style as also used in the SPHN RDF schema. Once the information is filled, you can move on to the next tab to check, which is the coding system and version tab. This is where you need to fill information about possible external terminologies that are being referenced in the project-specific schema but which are not already used in SPHN. So first, you need to check if the terminology you're interested in is already referenced and used by SPHN. If not, you can add it to this list. Some of these external terminologies are provided in RDF, and maybe you will be providing yours in RDF. For these cases, the table must be filled accordingly, and you will see now how to do it. In case the terminology is available in RDF from the source, you need to fill the following columns. Provide a short name, the full name, the way it is being versioned, together with an example in the first 4 columns. Then you can state in the column provided in RDF yes, because you do have an RDF file. The downloadable in RDF column should state if the RDF file can be downloaded somewhere from the web, the RDF file of the terminology. The provided by column must state the prefix of who is using the schema in the context of SPHN. So in this example here of Ordo, it is provided by SPHN and used in SPHN. That's why you can see the prefix of SPHN. But if it is a terminology you are providing in your project-specific schema and using it there, then you have to specify your project prefix. You have to define a prefix for the terminology. Then another important column is the root node column. you need to list all the root nodes or classes of the terminology so it gets interpreted correctly by our tooling when the project-specific RDF schema gets generated with the terminology imported. The canonical IRI must be the one defined from the terminology file, as well as the versioned IRI. A resource prefix should be provided, which will be used internally in the project-specific RDF schema to reference to the terminology in a single space. So it is actually different from the prefix of the terminology that you provided before. This could be something like SPHN followed by that prefix to distinguish between the codes and what we need for the project-specific schema. Finally, a resource IRI should be provided, and ideally following the biomed.it.ch IRI style and ending with the terminology prefix. When the terminology is not available in RDF from the source, you have the possibility to create an RDF file with the codes of that terminology yourself. In such case, the same information as previously should be provided with some exceptions. The short name, full name, coding system, and version example is unchanged and must be given still accordingly. The provided in RDF column should still say yes because you are building an RDF file for it and providing it for your schema. Downloadable in RDF is, however, most likely to be no, because first, the source providers are not providing the terminology in RDF, and second, you are most likely not going to host this terminology in RDF somewhere on the web and make it accessible because there might be some licensing or copyright information issues to take into account. Similarly to the Ordo example, you must provide the root nodes you are defining in your RDF schema of that terminology, a canonical IRI and a versioned IRI, which in this case could follow the biomed.it.ch style since you are the one building the RDF file. The resource prefix and IRI are not needed because we would simply use the canonical and versioned IRIs in the tooling to correctly place the terminology in the project-specific RDF schema. The exception remains if there exists a dereferenceable link on the web that leads to every single code of that terminology, then you can use that IRI as a canonical IRI and still define a resource and prefix and IRI in this case. So this is how we have done it for the ATC from WHO, for instance. Now that you have seen the two different cases, you can fill the coding system version and version tab accordingly and then move on to the next tab, which is the concept tab. The concept tab is where you can find all the semantics that are defined in the SPHN dataset, and this is where the project can add their own semantics as well. Below the last line, filled with an SPHN concept, or actually a composed of, the project can add their content. Please remember that you can't remove any line from the SPHN dataset template. Now we will go through an example to see how a project can fill this table for adding their own concepts. We take the example of a concept called cost, where the project needs information about the cost of an administrative case in which a patient is involved. The cost should contain the price or value and the currency information. You can already observe that the administrative case is actually already defined in SPHN as a concept, but all information related to the cost is not defined. Therefore, it has to be provided on the project level. Before filling the dataset template, though, the project needs to go through the whole process of semantically and accurately define what and how they want to represent this information. So you need to think about the name, descriptions, possible meaning bindings, possible value sets that can be used for restricting the value space of a property or composed of. You need to look into the standards, existing terminologies that can be used when possible instead of adding your own values. Cardinality restrictions that make sense should be thought about, as well as knowing existing SPHN content so that you can either reuse it or refer to them when needed. Once this step is achieved, you should have a design of your concept. In this example, we have a new concept cost, which is created with two composed of value and currency. Note that whenever we are referring to an element of the project, we use its prefix in front of the names. So here it's X semicolon cost, and same here. You can already connect some information to SPHN or existing SPHN content. Like, for instance, the currency code is actually of type code, and this is something that we already define in SPHN, so you can simply reuse the code from SPHN. We want in this project to connect the cost to the administrative case. As you know, administrative case exists in SPHN, and if you remember, a project can add their own composed of to existing SPHN concepts. This example shows you this case, a mix between SPHN existing concepts and new project composed of. So we want, in the context of this project, to add information of the costs in the administrative case, so we simply extend the administrative case with a new composed of called cost and make it accessible there. Then, suppose you also want to know for each administrative case information about the possible diagnosis-related groups, then it is also possible to add another composed of and add such information. In this case, the type of this composed of connects to SPHN code because the expected element for this information is a code statement, so you simply again reuse the SPHN code. Finally, fill in the cardinalities that are needed for each newly added composed of. Here, the administrative case can have at most one cost and one diagnosis-related group code. The cost, however, must have at least one and only one currency. Now that the concept and its composed ofs are designed, you can start to fill in the template. The release column corresponds to the version in which the content present in this line was either added or last updated. Since this is most likely your first schema, it most likely refers to the version you've added to the metadata tab. The second column needs to state if the line corresponds to a concept or a composed of. In the latter, a composed of can either be inherited as well, if you're describing a concept that inherits from another existing concept. In this case, all properties of the parent column must be inherited to the children concept. For more information, you can have a look to our Read the Docs documentation. Then add the general concept or composed of names with the prefix of the project when the content is actually about or from a project-specific addition. You can see here that the value doesn't have a prefix because value is already defined in SPHN and therefore we reuse it in the project. The currency code, though, doesn't exist in SPHN as a composed of, so it has to be defined under the project-specific namespace or prefix. Add the general description about the concept or the composed ofs and the type of this. For the type, it is the same pattern. If you refer to an SPHN concept, simply state it. But if you refer to a project-specific composed of, please add the prefix of the project in front. We will see an example in the next slides. Make sure to add the name of the standard terminologies in the standard column when values or codes must come from such external terminologies. And some columns that are not highlighted but which you should also fill are the contextualized name, description, and set the active status to yes. Some additional tips. So for concepts, you should use capsize notation for composed of only small letters in lowercase. Concept lines can be highlighted in bold so that they stand out and you see which composed of actually belong to which concept because they are usually below that concept. And as stated already previously, project-specific concepts and composed of must be referred with the project prefix in front, followed by the semicolon. And there's no need for adding a prefix when you refer to an SPHN concept or existing composed of. Then we come to the column parent, which needs you to understand a little bit of RDF on how you should fill it. So in RDF, elements, whether they are classes or properties, are grouped under a root element, and hierarchies are important to describe in RDF accurate data representation. In the case of concepts and properties that have a higher concept or property, the parent column would simply state that parent concept or property that you use somewhere else in your project-specific schema. If we take the example of the concept nursing diagnosis, it is inheriting from the concept diagnosis. Therefore, in the parent column of the nursing diagnosis concept, you will have written diagnosis. But for concepts and properties which do not inherit from anything defined in the project space or in SPHN, a root element must be provided. If we take the consent in SPHN, there is no higher concept that defines it in SPHN. Therefore, we define a root in the SPHN RDF schema as follows. So for concepts, we have the SPHN concept. For attribute objects, we have the SPHN attribute object. So this is for properties where the type is either a concept or something qualitative, meaning a value set that we define in the space of SPHN. And we also have the SPHN attribute data type for properties where the type is a quantitative string or temporal element. The project also needs to have such root elements so that the project RDF schema is well structured and all the concepts and composed of go under at least these root classes and properties. So using the prefix of the project, there's the patterns that are expected to be written in the parent column for project-specific concepts are the following. You should have example concept, example attribute object, example attribute data type. So in the case of cost, the parent is X concept. So you need to still provide the prefix followed by the semicolon and then this root concept name. The value, since it is defined in SPHN, you simply refer to the same parent that is used in the SPHN. So in this case, value is subclass of the or subconcept of the SPHN attribute data type. The currency code points to a code, so it is defined as a subproperty of the X attribute object. The next column of interest is the concept reference, which indicates for a given line to which concept it relates to. So for a concept, the concept reference is, of course, itself. So you see here that all these information are about the cost, so the concept reference is stated as being the cost. When you add new composed of to an existing SPHN concept, like in the example here where the project wants to add in the administrative case to composed of, there are two possible ways to do so. You can either create a new line below the SPHN concept and add the information about the project composed of with the project's prefix, or you can copy the SPHN concept line, only the concept line, not the SPHN composed ofs, at the end of the dataset template where you actually are adding your project specific concepts, and then you add the information about the project composed of. So we do have the two examples here. In option 1, you basically have the concept defined in SPHN, and below all the composed ofs from SPHN, you can simply add the lines that are needed and fill the table accordingly. Or with the option 2, this is the last concept we have in the project space, for instance, or we created the cost example and then we want to refer the cost to the administrative case. So we copied the line from SPHN of the administrative case and then we add the project specific composed ofs. Another important aspects are the cardinality, which enables you to indicate restrictions on the amount of instances of the actual data that can be connected to a given concept. We distinguish cardinalities that are related to composed ofs. So in this example, you can see that an administrative case can have 0 cost or at most 1 cost. It can also have 0 diagnosis related group code, or at most 1. Same applies here. The cost actually has necessarily 1 and only 1 value and 1 currency code. We also have 4 particular cardinalities where concept can directly link to an administrative case, to a data provider, a subject pseudo-identifier, or a source system. So you can see that the administrative case is connected to the data provider institute, and one administrative case must connect to at least 1 and only 1 data provider. Same to the subject pseudo-identifier and to the source system. For further information, you can go to our Read the Docs and read the documentation about it. And another element that you need to pay attention to is the use of external terminologies. You can refer to them when you would like to provide a meaning binding to a concept. So when a project-specific concept has the same meaning as an element defined in an external terminologies, you can simply add this external code to the meaning binding column. So in this example, you can see that the surgery concept that the project is defining is actually the same thing as defined with this SNOMED CT code of surgical procedure. So we connect these two and state that they have the same meaning. But you can also use external terminologies to define values or a subset of values that make sense and that are relevant and accepted as possible values provided for this composed of. So in this example, the surgery has a code that tells you what kind of surgery it is about. And in this case, we use all the codes from the surgical procedure. So SNOMED CT, for instance, is a hierarchical terminology. So under surgical procedure, you have all the different kinds of surgical procedures. So we state specifically here that we enable any value descendant of the surgical procedure to be valid as codes for surgery. There are some notations that have to be followed when stating those values, for which you can find a list of scenarios described in the SPHN Read the Docs. The last element to keep in mind is that a project can inherit from an SPHN concept, meaning that the project can create a concept which is a more specific element than that SPHN concept. In this case, the type of the project concept must refer to the SPHN concept. So the rare disease diagnosis is of type diagnosis from SPHN. All properties of diagnosis must be inherited and provided in the rare disease diagnosis as it is. The project is free, though, to narrow down the value sets or cardinalities as it fits for that specific concept. For this inherited concept, a project is free to add additional project-specific information that are needed. Like, for instance, here you have a subject age at onset that has been added to the rare disease diagnosis, which was not present in the diagnosis. We now summarize the basic rules for a project to edit concepts and composed of, which we have seen throughout this presentation. So a project can extend SPHN concepts with project-specific composed ofs. They can create new project-specific concepts with either reusing existing SPHN composed ofs, or they can also and will most likely create new project-specific composed of under those concepts. You can also inherit from SPHN or also project-specific concepts, which requires you to take in all the properties defined in the general concept to the more specific one. And these would be inherited composed ofs. Now that your dataset template is filled and complete with all additional information needed for your research questions, you can save it as a project-specific dataset. Then you can go to the Schema Forge web service, drop the file, click Run, And you should be able to obtain your project-specific RDF schema and all the related components, like the shackle rules, the SPARQL queries for obtaining some statistical information, and a human-readable HTML visualization of your schema. If you have an error, you can possibly fix it yourself in either the dataset, but you can also, and you are welcome to send an email to the DCC at dcc@sib.swiss to further inquire about the error. Thank you for your attention.